Okay, hi everybody, shalom, and thank you for coming. Appreciate it. Today's shir is dedicated for the Aliyot Neshamot of Binyamin Yisroel ben Shlomo HaLevy, Tzvia bas Dovid, Binyamin ben Moshe HaLevy, that is the father of Daniel Goldstein, and this Friday is the very first yard site. And we hope that all of the Divrei Torah should be for the elevation of all of these Neshamot. And Refuah Shelema to Stephen ben Chaya and Breya bat Chava. I'm sorry, Stephen ben Chava and Breya bat Chava. I'm not sure if it's brother and sister, but whatever. As well as all of those who are ill, whether it's COVID-related, not COVID-related, inoculated, uninoculated, and really those who are healthy all should have the bracha of remaining healthy. And it's a difficult time for us. It's been difficult for quite a long time. And I'm not going to allude to the more recent scandal difficulties that we faced in Klal Yisrael, which are also something that necessitate a great deal of cheshbon hanefesh. And when we ask Hashem for refuas haguf and refuas hanefesh also means that the psychological pain of trauma should also be alleviated, and people should be strengthened and have resilience and courage to go through the difficulties that life sometimes puts in their way. Finally, Rabbi Poston asked me to express all of our gratitude and thanks for those who contributed to the Yibaneh end of the year fundraising campaign. Baruch Hashem, Yibaneh was able to reach their goal, and as I've said many times already, Yibaneh is not only a forum for Shiurei Torah, not just mine again, but many excellent Shiurei Torah. And as well, it is a place of chesed, a place of showing caring and concern for all sorts of different needs in Yerushalayim and elsewhere. And through your very generous contribution, all of you, all of those who contributed, have a chelek in all of the Torah and all of the chesed that Yibaneh, Rabbi and Rebbetzin Poston in particular, carry out on a day-to-day basis. And may Hashem bless all of these supporters in the zechus of their hachzakas Torah v'chesed, and that they should have many brachos from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and have nachas from their children, and good health, and parnasa tova, and all of the other good things that Hashem gives us in our lives. So today we are still, of course, in the Parshiot of Yetzias Mitzrayim. Parshat Bo is the actual Yetzias Mitzrayim, and I want to start off with the observation of the Baal HaTanya that I did say last week, but I'm going to say it again because it's going to form the foundation of a further thought that we're going to talk about, and that is the famous passage in the Haggadah that is taken from a Mishnah, that Chayav Adam Liros Es Atzmo Ki'ilu Hu Yatsa Mitzrayim, that each person must regard themselves as if they themselves were taken out of Egypt. In other words, remembering the Exodus, at least Leil Pesach, is not merely remembering a historical event, but it is to feel that I myself was a slave in Mitzrayim, and Hashem liberated me from my slavery. You're not commemorating, you are actually experiencing. Now, I want to draw a contrast between that and another statement in the Haggadah that superficially sounds kind of similar, but it is different. In the beginning of the Haggadah, we say, Ilu lo hotzi HaKadosh Baruch Hu es avoseinim miMitzrayim. If Hashem wouldn't have taken our forefathers out of Egypt, we and our children and our grandchildren would still be enslaved. So we have to be grateful because Yetzias Mitzrayim benefited us that we are not slaves. Now that is not the same as the first statement. That is not saying I have to feel that I was a slave. That simply says the Yetzias Mitzrayim of my ancestors benefited me. So that's statement number one. Statement number 2 is going way beyond that. Statement number 2 is not simply making the claim that Yetzias Mitzrayim benefited me, but rather I myself was a participant in Yetzias Mitzrayim. Chayav Adam, right? That a person, Liros Asatzmo, Ki'ilu, Hu Yatzami Mitzrayim. So the question becomes, what is the meaning of that idea? I mean, that's not true. It just isn't true. It's one thing to say, yeah, I benefit from God liberating the Jews from Mitzrayim, because had he not liberated them, there might not have been a Jewish people. Therefore, I'm here because of that. Okay, fair enough. But I wasn't in Egypt. I wasn't a slave in Egypt. In what way can that statement even be true? So the emes is, the Rambam seems to understand it as a form of method acting, if I could use this irreverent idea. And that is, a method actor, Marlon Brando, Lee Strasberg, whatever it would be, the concept would be you put yourself in the role by imagining what it would be like. So the Rambam seems to indicate it is an imaginary exercise, so you will feel the power of the event. In other words, it's hard for me to imagine, especially when I grew up free. I don't really understand what slavery was. So imagine, visualize. So according to the Rambam, it is enlisting the power of the imagination to emotionally put you in a certain historical moment. Which means it is make-believe, but it's make-believe enlisted for a good purpose, a higher purpose. Harnessing the power of imagination to achieve a spiritual growth. But I mentioned last week, and again, forgive me for repeating, but it'll be necessary for tonight as well, the very powerful thought of the Baal HaTanya, and others say it as well, that the word Mitzrayim itself has a double meaning. Mitzrayim does mean ancient Egypt, an empire that enslaved us, an empire that was toppled by the 10 plagues and the splitting of the Red Sea. And that is not a metaphor, that is a historical reality. But Mitzrayim also has a symbolic metaphorical meaning. That the word Mitzrayim comes from Meitzar. Dovid HaMelech in Tehillim says, Min ha-Meitzar karatika. I call out to God from the narrow confinements of desperation. Mitzarim is boundaries, constrictions, blockages, inhibitions. So when we talk about being enslaved in Mitzrayim, the Baal HaTanya says, there is a double meaning. Enslaved in a country and an empire called Egypt, but it also refers to the inner blockages and constraints that every human being has. And in that sense, says the Baal HaTanya, every Jew, every person, not just Jew even, has their own Mitzrayim. A Mitzrayim is whatever is within me that prevents me from connecting to God and realizing my potential. A person can have a Mitzrayim of gaiva, of arrogance. A person can have a Mitzrayim of depression and despair. There could be anger. There could be laziness. There could be hedonism. There could be greed. There could be selfishness. These are my Mitzrayims. And every person must acknowledge that they have a Mitzrayim. Probably more than one. And as the old saying goes, it's easier to take the Jew out of Mitzrayim than it is to take Mitzrayim out of the Jew. So what the Baal HaTanya says, when God did a Yetziat Mitzrayim, when he took the Jewish people out of Mitzrayim, he put a spiritual power into the world that enables every person to link to that Yetziat Mitzrayim as a cosmic event and become liberated from the inner Mitzrayim that enslaves them. You know, people sometimes debate, not so much from people, but people generally debate. Yeah, pardon me, just have a bad cough here. People debate whether the Torah should be understood as history or metaphor. So for example, you talk about Adam and Eve, is that literal? Is that literal stuff? Or is that a metaphor for good and evil in the world? Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Avot, are they mythical figures? Are they historical figures? Yetziat Mitzrayim, did it happen? Didn't it happen? Is it a metaphor for something? But I would suggest to you that that is a false dichotomy. Because the Torah is both history and metaphor, because the historical events themselves are prototypes for spiritual forces that exist in the Breya. Yetziat Mitzrayim is a perfect example. We believe, a person with Amunah in the Torah believes, that Yetziat Mitzrayim is an actual historical event. Now granted, we can have another discussion some other time about the archaeological evidence or lack thereof and what do you do with it. But the bottom line is, we believe the Jews were enslaved in Mitzrayim, and they were taken out. On that level, the Torah is literal history. But history itself is a vehicle for God to implant into the world spiritual powers that can continue to be activated. That's why the whole concept of time in Judaism is not linear, but it's cyclical. You understand? Linear implies past is past, we're moving from past to present to future, and if I think about the past, all I can do is commemorate something that happened. But in Judaism, certainly based on the way the Mekubalim explain, you're not commemorating a past event, but the very same spiritual power that enabled that event to occur reoccurs in that cyclical path. So the Baal HaTanya's beautiful insight is, each person must regard themselves as if they were taken out of Mitzrayim, is my statement of emunah, that God will give me the capacity to be liberated from my own inner Mitzrayim. That the koach of Geula, the koach of cherus, right, the power of redemption, the power of freedom that God put into the world continues to be activated and reactivated. Be'ikar during Pesach, but the truth is during these Parshiot as well. The light of Yetziat Mitzrayim permeates. Spiritual liberation. Now, in the 60s, they probably still do it, kind of the countercultural movements, the Chavurah movement, Jewish renewal movement, they put out all sorts of Haggadahs that were theme Haggadahs, like the civil rights Haggadah, whatever it is. I mean, they even have gay and lesbian Haggadahs. Okay, I don't want to go there that much. And now, putting aside the specific issues of that, I don't want to talk about those specific issues. But on one level, you look at those Haggadahs and say, oh, you're just doing political correct stuff. That has no connection to Pesach. But on some level it does, because the truth of the matter is, when we read the Haggadah, and during these weeks, when we read the Parshiot of Yetzias Mitzrayim, according to the Baal HaTanya, we are doing a double message. There is the general message of the narrative, which is the historical reality of how Am Yisrael became formed as a nation. And that is our shared history. That is what we have in common as Jews. Yetziat Mitzrayim followed by Matan Torah, both steps, is what made us a nation. And that has to be lovingly shared and recounted once a year or twice a year in Chutz La'aretz in great detail, and every single day in a more abbreviated way. You got to remember it. You got to think about it. Our history made us who we are. But that is what I call the communal narrative. That is what I call the national narrative, the formation of the Jewish people. But the Baal HaTanya is suggesting that there's also an idiosyncratic private meaning to the Exodus narrative that pertains to every person's individualistic challenge in their life. And that is, my Mitzrayim. Liberate me, free me, enable me to transcend my boundaries, my constrictions, my limitations. Open my heart. Take away my anger, my ego. So in a sense, generalizing the Exodus to all of these other causes has a certain resonance. Again, I'm not validating the causes, that's a separate thing. But the concept of broadening Yetziat Mitzrayim beyond the particular historical event actually makes a certain amount of religious sense, because it acknowledges that Mitzrayim can exist in many, many forms. There could be the Mitzrayim of greed, the Mitzrayim of cutthroat capitalism, the Mitzrayim of abuse, both the imprisonment of the abused victim and the Mitzrayim of the abuser that somehow got forced, well, I don't want to say got forced, but somehow is in the trap of these passions that are seemingly, not really, but seemingly beyond control. And they need to be liberated. Abuser and abused need to be liberated from that destructive slavery that inhibits them, that stops them, that chains them, that blocks them. Yetziat Mitzrayim. So that's a marvelous, beautiful insight from the Baal HaTanya, that Chayav Adam Lirot Es Atzmo Ki'ilu Hu Yatsa MiMitzrayim does not mean I gotta make believe I was a slave in Egypt. That's not a true statement. But I believe I have a Mitzrayim, and I believe that Hashem will give me the wherewithal to become liberated from my Mitzrayim, provided I do the work that's necessary to achieve that liberation, which we will proceed to talk about in a moment. So we know that when the Jewish people were commanded to get ready to leave Mitzrayim, they were given a set of commands on Rosh Chodesh Nisan. That's 2 weeks before the Exodus. They were already given all the laws about Korban Pesach and everything else. And here I want to start off with a technical question, and maybe you've thought of this question. It's an interesting question. 2 weeks before Pesach, God told them that you're going to bring the Korban Pesach, and you're going to eat matzah and maror the night of the Seder, and for 7 days you are not allowed to have chametz, you're not allowed to have unleavened bread, leavened bread, and you're not even allowed to own it. Right? You know that chametz is unique, that not only is there a prohibition of eating chametz, you're not even allowed to own chametz, which is why we have the rules that you sell your chametz to a guy, etc. Now, rabbinically, this is rabbinically, if a Jew owned chametz during Pesach, that chametz cannot be eaten forever, even after Pesach it's usher. That's called chametz she'avar olav haPesach. That's a problem. It's less of a problem in Israel because the Rabbanut arranges almost every store, Jewish store in Israel, sells its chametz on Pesach. But in the United States, it's a considerable problem. Those of you might remember that after Pesach, every rabbi has to circulate a list of what stores you can buy from, what stores you cannot buy from, because if it's a non-Jewish store, you could buy chametz after Pesach, not during Pesach, after Pesach. If it's a Jewish store that didn't sell the chametz, you have to wait until there's a turnover of inventory, so that everything in the store that's chametz was purchased after Pesach. By the way, this is actually a much more complicated shiloh than you might assume, because people think the only thing I care about is the identity of the retailer. Well, you know, it's not only that. You got to look at the distributor that the retailer got it from. So even if the retailer got the stuff after Pesach, if the Jewish distributor owned it during Pesach, you're going to have a problem. That's especially a problem with whiskey. You know, whiskey is all chametz, basically, Scotch, bourbon, rye. And whiskey is kept by distributors, for a long time. So even if a retailer, Jewish liquor store, got its Scotch, after Pesach, who had it during Pesach? And as you might expect, in the liquor business, Jewish ownership is quite prominent, and as a result, there are major distributor problems. Okay, but again, these are halachic matters that you need to be aware of. But the point I'm making is this. When were the Jewish people given the commandment to have matzah, Leil Pesach, not to eat chametz for 7 days, and not to own chametz for 7 days? They were given this commandment 2 weeks before Pesach. 2 weeks before Pesach, they were told, when that day comes, when the 15th of Nisan comes, you're going to have these laws. Actually, even from Erev Pesach, you're not allowed to eat chametz from part of the day. Now, but then we have a question. Because later the Torah says that when the Jewish people were going to leave Mitzrayim in the morning, they wanted to bake bread. They wanted to bake bread. But the Egyptians were pushing them, get out, get out, get out. And God was also telling them, get out, get out, get out. We didn't have time to let our dough rise because we had to leave b'chipazon. We had to leave in such a rush that we didn't have time to let our dough rise. And that is why we immediately had to bake our dough as matzah, unleavened bread. Now, as you know, halachically, when water mixes with flour, it only takes 18 minutes for the fermentation to be considered chametz. So when we say they didn't have time to let their dough rise, they didn't even have the 18 minutes. Now the pashtus is because Paro was saying, get out of here. After the Mahakas Bechoros, Paro said, I don't want you anymore. The Arizal learns a different pshat. The Arizal understands that the problem is that the Jewish people were on the 49th level of impurity. And had they stayed, we don't even know what this means, had they stayed even the little bit of time that it would take for matzah to become chametz, they would have hit level 50. So I don't understand, and the question I want to share with you is, how do you understand the second narrative in light of the first set of commandments? Because the second narrative implies that had, let's say Paro and Hashem would have said, take your time, you got to leave, but bake all the bread that you want. The implication of the Torah is they would have made it chametz. The reason they didn't make it chametz is because they were told on the morning of the 15th, leave. But the question is, if they were given that commandment, Rosh Chodesh Nisan, then they already were told that once Pesach comes, they're not allowed to have chametz. And I want to emphasize, not only were they told they're not allowed to eat chametz, they were told they're not allowed to have chametz. So even if they would have been given the time, they couldn't have had chametz anyway. So how can you say, for example, that the reason I eat matzah is to commemorate the haste by which the Jews had to leave Egypt? It does not commemorate the haste by which the Jews had to leave Egypt, because even if there had not been a hastening, they weren't allowed to have chametz, because they were already given the Isser from Rosh Chodesh. Right? It's a good kasha. Meaning, l'chayra, the Isser of chametz is not connected to chipazon, because they were prohibited to do it even before that. So the Ran in Arvei Psachim actually asks this kasha. Other Rishonim ask the kasha as well. And the Ran makes a very interesting halachic distinction between the first Pesach in Mitzrayim and the future Pesachs, every other year. And he actually shows, again, it's hard to show you this in the language of the Psukim itself, but if you carefully examine the language of the Psukim, the implication is that the laws against ownership of chametz only kicked in year 2. Meaning God gave it, in other words, there are two things. The immediate law that applies to you this year is you bring a korban pesach and you got to eat matzah the first night. But the laws against eating chametz for 7 days and the laws against owning chametz for 7 days were not to be activated until the next year. And again, and he shows this from the language of the verses. Memela, the Ran says, that the morning of the 15th, the Jewish people did have the right to bake bread. They ate, the night before, they ate matzah. The night before, they ate matzah, for sure. But the morning of the 15th, they did have the ability to bake chametz stick of bread. But because of the chipazon, in other words, the way you understand it is this. God gave them a mitzvah Rosh Chodesh Nisan, whose reason would not be understood until a later historical event happened. God tells them, in effect, this year you're going to eat matzah at the Seder, with the Korban Pesach. Next year, I'm telling you, you're not allowed to have chametz for 7 days. You're not allowed to eat chametz for 7 days. You're not allowed to own chametz for 7 days. But at that point, we don't know why. Gee, why is God telling me next year I'm not allowed to have chametz for 7 days? I don't know. God told me that. But the answer is, you know why you're not allowed to have chametz next year for 7 days? Because when you're going to try to bake bread the morning of the 15th, you're going to be kicked out of Egypt so quickly that this will be a zecher to the chipazon. So you understand what's going on? Meaning, on the morning of the 15th, the Jewish people had the right to bake chametz. Because the law against owning chametz and eating chametz for 7 days isn't going to be activated till next year. But until the historical event of chipazon, they didn't understand why. And the historical event of chipazon now makes them understand what's going on. So based on this, Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky has a very, very fascinating observation. If you think about this, therefore, what was the meaning of the matzah? In other words, we say we eat matzah on Pesach and we don't eat chametz on Pesach to remember the chipazon. But the first time we had to eat matzah, there was no chipazon story yet. Because we ate matzah the night of the 15th, the chipazon didn't occur till the next morning. So here's the question. What was the significance of matzah that was eaten the first Seder? We can eat matzah during the Seder because we remember the chipazon. But they weren't remembering the chipazon because the chipazon didn't happen yet. So what was the concept of matzah the first Seder? The answer is, matzah itself has a dual symbolism. Matzah is a commemoration of the redemption from Egypt, to remind us of how quickly God took us out. But matzah is also a commemoration of slavery itself. It is called lechem oni. It is the bread of slaves. The Ibn Ezra writes that Ibn Ezra was a traveler, and he saw that slaves in India would be fed unleavened bread because it stayed in their stomachs a very long time, and the masters didn't have to give them a lot of food. So matzah is a complex symbol. When I eat matzah, I remember the slavery of Egypt. And when I eat matzah, I remember the geula of Egypt that was b'chipazon. Matzah is both avdus and cheiros, in contradistinction to maror, which is only avdus, and something like the 4 cups of wine, which is only cheiros, although that's Rabbanan. Matzah is avdus and cheiros. So the point is, the first Seder, matzah could only be avdus. I mean, what did they think about? They're eating matzah to remember the slavery. They should never forget it. Lechem oni, the bread of affliction. The next year, matzah acquired the additional symbol of cheiros based on chipazon. So you see how the Ran understands all of the different verses. That indeed, the morning of the 15th, they could have baked bread. Because the prohibition against eating chametz for 7 days and owning chametz isn't going to be activated till next year. But they didn't know why until the event of chipazon happened. It was like a chok until that point. So based on this, Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky has a very, very fascinating chiddush lahalacha. Oh, by the way, I just want to point out, these 2 dimensions of matzah are illustrated in the Haggadah itself. Because the Haggadah begins with the statement in Aramaic, Ha lachma anya. This is the bread of affliction, the bread of poverty, the bread of suffering. That's telling us that the matzah is a reminder of what it's like to be persecuted, what it's like to be a slave. But then at the end of Magid, we bring Rabban Gamliel's statement that the meaning of matzah is we didn't have time to let our dough rise until God redeemed us. So that we move from the matzah of slavery to the matzah of freedom. Now here, Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky says a very interesting chiddush. We know that the halacha is that you're not allowed, you cannot be yotzei at the Seder with matzah that is called egg matzah. Now this is called matzah ashira, rich matzah. You can't use matzah which has oil in it, or fruit juice, or egg yolk, or chocolate, because matzah has to be lechem oni, the bread of affliction. It cannot be bread that's rich and that a wealthy person might eat. Now, l'maisa, again, this is complicated. Ashkenazim actually have the practice that they don't eat matzah ashira for all of Pesach. Sephardim do. So maybe we'll save that for another time. But the one thing that for sure is, whether you're Ashkenazi or Sephardi, you cannot fulfill the mitzvah of the Seder with matzah ashira, because matzah has to be the bread of slavery. Now, there's a shita of the Vilna Gaon that says a very interesting thing. The Vilna Gaon says, although the obligation of eating matzah is only Leil Seder, right? The rest of Pesach, I'm not allowed to eat chametz, but I don't have to have matzah. If I don't like matzah, I don't have to eat matzah. But the Vilna Gaon says, every kezayit of matzah that you eat, you are fulfilling a mitzvah. This is a chiddush of the Gemara. This is why there are people who are makpid. Every single day of Pesach, they will eat matzah, because even though it's not obligatory, but nevertheless, it is a mitzvah if you do it. This is a category that is called in halacha mitzvah kiyumit. A mitzvah chiyuvit is a mitzvah that you must do. Right? I've got to read Shema. A mitzvah kiyumit is a mitzvah that you don't have to do, but if you do it, Hashem rewards you for a mitzvah. By the way, as a total digression, let me mention that we know that the Ramban has the well-known shita that living in Eretz Yisrael is a mitzvah, right? The Ramban, unlike the Rambam, unlike Maimonides, says living in Eretz Yisrael is a mitzvah. Rav Moshe Feinstein, however, has a tshuva in which he asserts that even according to Ramban, it is only mitzvah kiyumit and not mitzvah chiyuvit. So Rav Moshe kind of gave a green light for people not to make aliyah, because he said it's not a chiyuvit. Again, I am not being modest at all when I say that I am absolutely lower than dirt compared to Rav Moshe. I mean, this is not false modesty. Please be assured of that. But I do have to say that Rav Moshe's understanding of Ramban is tzarich iyun gadol ma'od, because the Ramban's language is almost explicit that it is an obligation, not just if you do it, you get a mitzvah. So that's an interesting shaila. How do you classify aliyah? But the Gra does say, the Vilna Gaon does say, that eating matzah every day of Pesach is a mitzvah kiyumit. So here's what Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky said. The mitzvah kiyumit of the whole week, you can fulfill even with egg matzah. Why is that so? Because it's only Leil Seder that the significance of matzah is the bread of affliction and poverty. And the proof is because initially it didn't have the chipazon rationale, because the chipazon rationale didn't kick in till the next morning. So even though by the next year matzah acquired an additional significance, it never lost its original significance as lechem oni. So matzah ashira is not lechem oni. But by contrast, with respect to eating matzah the rest of the week, that's only zecher l'chipazon. That is not because of lechem oni. So zecher l'chipazon applies to any unleavened bread, whether it's rich matzah or poor matzah. It didn't rise. So Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky wants to be mechadesh that you could be mekayim the mitzvah kiyumit of the Gra with matzah ashira. Now again, I have to emphasize that halachically for Ashkenazim this is not going to work at all, simply because Ashkenazim do not eat matzah ashira. for all of Pesach. For chametz reasons, there are different other complications. But for Sephardim that do eat, again, I'm not sure if Sephardim follow the Gra here anyway, but for the Sephardim who do eat matzah ashira, they could be yotzei the mitzvah kiyumit of achilas matzah, even with matzah ashira. That's Rav Yaakov Chiddush. You understand the idea, because the chisaron of matzah ashira is it is not a commemoration of servitude, but that is an aspect only of Leil Seder matzah. That is not an aspect of matzah the rest of Pesach. And the proof is because the first Seder, it had to be based on lechem only because there was no other event to which it could be connected. So that's, again, a very, very fascinating chiddush. And based on the Ran, you can now understand that the whole sequence of the mitzvot is a bit more complicated than you would imagine. And matzah itself, as I say, is a complicated symbol because it emphasizes both slavery and freedom, as opposed to marar, which is only slavery, and as opposed to dalit kosot, which is only freedom, as opposed to reclining, again, that's a rabbinic requirement, that is freedom. The Seder combines in matzah, or the Torah combines in matzah, this dual symbolism. So now, let's focus on another statement which is connected to these mitzvot, and that is a famous statement of Rabban Gamliel that is in the Mishnah and is incorporated in the Haggadah. Anyone that does not explain the significance of the three cardinal mitzvos of the Seder does not fulfill his obligation. Pesach, the Korban Pesach, the Paschal Lamb, Matzah, and Morah. Now, when it says, has not fulfilled his obligation, what obligation do you not fulfill if you don't explain these things? So here's a very important point. He doesn't mean you haven't fulfilled matzah, pesach, and maror. Meaning, if I eat matzah and I didn't explain it, I've still done the mitzvah of matzah, I ate it. If I eat maror and I didn't explain it, I've done the mitzvah. So he doesn't mean you haven't been yotzei, pesach, matzah, maror. He means you haven't been yotzei Haggadah. You haven't been yotzei your narrative obligation unless you explain Pesach, Matzah, Morah. Okay? You are yotzei Pesach, Matzah, Morah. You're not yotzei the mitzvah of Haggadah. By the way, a little bit of a note, again, I know I'm talking a little ahead of the calendar here, but these are the Parshiyot, so I'm taking the liberty of talking about some Pesach in Yonim. You know, this Rabbi Gamliel statement is towards the end of Magid. And towards the end of Magid, before the second cup, people are getting hungry, they're looking forward to their meal. So sometimes the people who handle the food, I don't want to be chauvinist, will tend to be the woman of the house, but it doesn't have to be. But the people will be getting up and going into the kitchen, etc. So precisely the part of the Haggadah that they might miss is the Rabban Gamliel paragraphs. And the truth of the matter is, that's the one part of the Haggadah you cannot skip. If you skip the four sons, as entertaining as that is, you are yotzei the mitzvah of Haggadah. If you miss the Rabban Gamliel paragraph, you're not yotzei. So if someone is going to get up and go into the kitchen, they should say the Rabban Gamliel paragraphs ahead of time, either, and again, in any language, because any part of that Haggadah can be said in Hebrew or English, but they have to be sure to say it. Either say it before they go, which is best, or say it, before the second cup, when they come back. In other words, that's bedafka, the one part of the Haggadah that's non-negotiable, and you cannot skip, and yet experience sometimes, I've learned that sometimes that's the part of the Haggadah that people bedafka might miss by going into the kitchen or whatever it is. But be it as it may, Rabbi Gamliel mentions these three cardinal mitzvos, Pesach, Matzah, Morah. So what I want to do in the little bit of time we have is connect these three mitzvos to the more global message of Yetziat Mitzrayim. Going back to the Baal HaTanya. The Baal HaTanya again tells us that Yetziat Mitzrayim is not only about commemorating the liberation from Egypt, but it's about identifying my own inner Mitzrayim. and tapping into the power of Yetziat Mitzrayim to become liberated. We can actually look at Pesach, Matzah, and Maror as different steps that I can internalize in my life towards the achievement of spiritual liberation. Now I'm going to go in reverse order, and I'll explain why after I go through it. Let's start with Maror. Maror is eating something bitter, although it doesn't have to be that bitter. Your romaine lettuce is not so bitter, but something that has a bitter taste. So we should remember that we're slaves. What's the lesson to that? The lesson to that is that the first step towards achieving spiritual liberation from that which enslaves you is you have to have the honesty to recognize that you're a slave. The first step to be free is to recognize there's a problem. Until you recognize there's a problem, there's no way you can do anything about it, because you don't even think there's something you have to do. So Maror is an indispensable element towards achieving liberation, because it reminds me that I'm enslaved. I'm enslaved to my taiva, my ego, my greed, my laziness. I got to be honest with myself. It doesn't mean I got to parade my sins to other people, but be honest with myself. I remember, I used to teach at the University of Maryland in Baltimore, and I lived in Silver Spring, Maryland. So those of you that know that part of the United States, so that's south, right? Washington, Silver Spring is south of Baltimore. So in order to get to Baltimore, you have to drive 95 north, right? Major highway, 95 north. But there's a turnoff to 95 south. So if you're not thinking, you could actually find yourself going south. So I remember one time when I was relatively new to the area, I was driving along to Baltimore, and all of a sudden, I was kind of in a reverie, a little bit of a, not falling asleep, but just thinking about something. So all of a sudden I noticed the Washington Monument, the Jefferson Memorial, and I said, I never saw that going from Silver Spring to Baltimore. Now, I didn't want to admit I was on 95 South going towards Virginia, because I didn't know how to correct myself if I was. I didn't really know. Now, I could go all the way to Florida. 95 South ends at Key West, Florida, and then you make a nice U-turn. So I could have done that, but I would have been very late to class. It wouldn't be. So it's an amazing thing. I can't even explain this rationally, so don't ask me to explain it rationally. I didn't want to admit to myself I was lost. So I started telling myself, maybe you never noticed. Maybe you can see those monuments from 95 North. You just never noticed, like you're seeing something new. And maybe you're okay. Or maybe if I just keep going, somehow it'll get better. Somehow. Now, this is actually a mistake we make all the time. You throw good money after bad, right? All of these things. And of course, Einstein's famous definition of insanity: do the same thing over and over again and expect to get a different result. Right? Crazy. So the truth of the matter is, I'm driving along further and further into Virginia because I didn't want to admit. But my ability to correct myself could only exist when I admitted I was lost. I always tell my wife that GPSs were invented by male engineers because women were willing to ask for directions. So they didn't need a GPS. A man refuses to ask for a direction, so we needed a GPS. Otherwise we would be perpetually lost. We would never get out of our quandary. So this is a very important idea. You want to achieve freedom? Recognize you're a slave. Don't sweep it under the rug. Don't live in denial. If things aren't working in relationships, if things aren't working in your personality, if things aren't working in your yeshiva, recognize it. Deal with it. Be honest. Until a slave knows he's a slave, he cannot take steps to freedom. Now, I do not want to talk about the Chaim Walder thing tonight, really, but I just want to say that this has relevance to an issue such as sexual abuse or child abuse, whatever it would be, in the religious community. For far too long, we've closed our eyes. For far too long, we've just denied it. For far too long, we just made believe it didn't exist. But making believe that something doesn't exist doesn't take it away. And if there's a silver lining to this compounded tragedy, which is a dark tragedy on so many levels, maybe it takes us out of a state of illusion and it forces us to confront painful and difficult realities. And that is painful. It hurts a lot. But in confronting that reality, we're taking the first step to be able to make it better. Okay, and that's what Morar is. Morar is the honesty of recognizing my slavery as an indispensable step towards freedom. We then come to Matzah. Now, we discussed a few moments ago that Matzah is a dual symbol of slavery and freedom. That's one perspective of Matzah. That's certainly a very valid perspective in the Haggadah. But there are other aspects of Matzah. As you know, Matzah represents humility because it's not puffed up and arrogant, although some of the matzah rolls they make actually look like chametz. But generally speaking, matzah is humility. But Maharal has another take on matzah that's very interesting. Maharal points out that chametz represents inertia and matzah represents corrective action. Let's think about this. If water falls on flour, you don't need to make it chametz. You don't need yeast. You don't need a starter. Inertia. If you do nothing for 18 minutes, it's chametz. Chametz is not created by action. Chametz is created by inaction, inertia. Matzah requires that you arrest the fermentation process by putting it in an oven within 18 minutes. So the Maharal says one of the symbols of chametz and matzah, one is arrogance versus humility, another is inertia versus action. So if moror is identifying my slavery, matzah connotes the imperative of doing something about it. And this is interesting. This might be the difference, let's say, between psychoanalysis and behavioral therapy. Psychoanalysis is there, again, I'm obviously overgeneralizing, stereotyping. I don't want to offend any therapists or analysts, but in its purest theoretical form, psychoanalysis is about getting insight, understanding your condition, understanding every trauma you've ever been through. Birth trauma, pre-birth trauma, preconception trauma, whatever it would be. And people could be in analysis for 50 years. And they understand every little thing that's wrong with them. But a behavioral therapist would say, what are you going to do about it? It's nice to have insight. It's nice to have understanding. But what concrete changes are you going to do? And sometimes people get so mired in this attempt to understand that they don't necessarily move forward in constructive ways. That's the idea of professional victimhood. Again, also has a certain relevance here, in which a person is so conscious of their victimhood status, which can be very real. God forbid, I'm not diminishing that. But they're not willing necessarily or ready to move forward. So if moror is the cognitive awareness of my slavery, matzah represents the imperative of action. You know, there was a very famous American academic, Robert Hutchins, who was kind of almost a child prodigy. He became president of the University of Chicago at the age of 25. He was actually younger than many of the graduate students in the school. Really brilliant, brilliant man. And he was not taking care of himself physically. So someone said, you know, Dr. Hutchins, don't you ever have the desire to exercise, to jog or whatever? So he responded, I surely do have that desire, but I know whenever I get that desire, I know if I lie down for a few moments, it'll pass. So I don't let it bother me. Now, the truth is, that's the way it is with exercise for sure. And that's the way it is with a lot of spiritual life as well. All of us have moments of inspiration. There are times in life when we really want to make things better. And there are many different things that can inspire us. It might be a Pesach Seder, it might be living in Eretz Yisrael, going to the Kotel. It might be, when you're a little older, the wedding of a child or a grandchild. It might be a funeral, where a person thinks about life and life is finite. And we have moments of inspiration after Yom Kippur. But if you don't concretize the inspiration into action, it dissipates. It disappears. It doesn't last. When you concretize it, it's like you're nailing it down. And then mitzvah goreret mitzvah. That little step that you took, it'll give you strength to do more. If you don't concretize it, it just vanishes very, very quickly. So moror is linked with matzah because moror is the awareness of my slavery, and matzah is the imperative of doing something about my slavery, taking action. Bein adam lechavero is the same thing. Let's assume that you've had a disagreement with somebody for a long time. You haven't spoken. I know myself. Every once in a while you get a feeling, why don't I pick up the phone? Why don't I make that connection? Well, that's going to work if the phone is right next to you. By the time you walk to the next room, you'll say, nah, maybe not today. That's what happens. That's how fast inspiration can wear off. The time that it takes to walk from one room to another room, say, maybe not today. Right? So that's what matzah is. Think about building a bridge. How do you build a bridge? These huge bridges. It starts with a single cable. A cable. It's a thick cable, but the cable could hold, 10,000 pounds. And then you put another cable on top of that, another on top of that, and then it's thick, and then it could bear the weight of tons and tons and tons. But you need that single cable to start the process. Now, we then come to Pesach. Again, I'm going in reverse order, and I'll explain why I'm going in reverse order. Now, the Korban Pesach has many, many halachos. Obviously, a whole half of Maseches Pesachim is about the Korban Pesach. Half of the tractate is about the Korban Pesach. But one of the very interesting halachos of the Korban Pesach, which is a machlokas in the Gemara, but the Rambam so paskins, is that you cannot bring the Pesach as a solitary individual. Meaning, even if I have a big appetite, and it's a very small little lamb, only 30 days old, so I could finish the whole thing. Right? They have these contests, these five pound meat eating contests, whatever it would be. So a little lamb could be 4 pounds. I could do it. The halacha is you can't. The Korban Pesach you must join with other people. If this is called a chabura. If it's your family, it's your family. If you don't have family, you got to connect to a family or other people. Form their own chabura. Ein shochten es ha-Pesach al hayochid. You cannot slaughter the Korban Pesach for a solitary individual. What lesson does that teach us? If Pesach is about spiritual liberation, it's teaching us that in our journey from our own inner Mitzrayim to freedom and liberation, we have to be part of a community. We cannot do it by ourselves. We need friends. Now, Pirkei Avos says, Kinei lecha chaver. In fact, that's a very interesting expression. Aseh lecha rav, make for yourself a teacher. Kinei lecha chaver. Kinei, buy for yourself a friend. What does it mean, buy for yourself a friend? So some say, well, a therapist, you're buying a friend for 50 minutes. This person is your best friend. But you got to pay for it. But some say the following. Friendship does have a cost. The cost of friendship is your willingness to be a friend. Right? If I want somebody to listen to my sorrows, to give me comfort when I have problems, I have to be a person who's willing to do the same for him. In other words, the Mishnah is merames, that true friendship creates reciprocal responsibilities. Kinei lecha, You got to invest in friendship. You got to pay something for friendship. You want a friend, you got to be a friend. You can't be the person who, whenever you have a problem, you go to people and you want them to help you, but when they need you, you're not available. Unfortunately, many of us have friends like that sometimes, but they're not truly friends. Now, the Rambam says a beautiful thing about friendship. The Rambam discusses, why is friendship important? Why do I need a friend? For what? So the Rambam says there are 3 reasons why we have friends. One might be called utilitarian. There are times in life in which we're in difficult predicaments. We lost the keys to our house. Our car broke down, middle of the highway. If I don't have friends, like, who do I call? So in that utilitarian sense, a friend is like a life insurance policy or an insurance policy, meaning I don't really need friends, but there are going to be times that I do, so it's good to have that investment in case things go wrong. We'll call that the utilitarian model of friendship. The second reason for a friend, the Rambam says, is social. Human beings are lonely. We need companionship. Aristotle remarked, in fact the Rambam probably got this from Aristotle, man is a social animal. So we need someone to schmooze, to share. And all of that is true. Utilitarianism and social friendship is important. But the Rambam says, and by the way, that can certainly be with husband and wife. I'm not suggesting it has to be outside the marriage. It can be in the marriage itself. In fact, chassan and kala are called re'im ahuvim, beloved friends. Itself very, very important, that the highest title we can give to married life is the friendship of people who love each other. But the Rambam then says the highest purpose of friendship is not utilitarian or social, but is a type of spiritual fellowship in which each one wants to build the other to be the best person they could be. Now that type of friendship is not an easy friendship, because if I truly love my friend and I want them to be better, I will sometimes have to point out ways in which I think he or she is not doing their best, and I have to be open to have the person point that out to me. See, when you're friends on a social level, so you can let things slide. The person might be selfish, egotism, whatever. We can have a nice dinner together. We can watch a basketball game together, and there is place in life for that type of friendship. But the deepest friendship is the friendship in which each person helps the other grow spiritually. That is, of course, the highest dimension of a marriage, in which each person makes the other person better because of their connection. That's what Breya Mahuvim actually means. So consequently, when we talk about the idea of the Korban Pesach, and we connect it to spiritual liberation, what we are talking about is the need to find a community with which you can move forward. The community can be as little as husband and wife, although optimally it should be, right? It could be a shul, it could be a yeshiva, it could be a chavrusa. Ideally, we should have some connection to all of these things, right? Because the understanding is, as Shlomo HaMelech says in Koheles, 2 are better than 1, because if one falls down by himself, who will pick him up? But if there are 2 people and one falls down, one can pick up the other, and the threefold cord is even better. Now Shlomo HaMelech is not only talking about ice. Yeah, it's true, if I slip on the ice and I'm all by myself, it may be hard to get up. But he's talking about life in a much more general sense. All of us have moments of weakness, moments of fear, moments of hesitation, confusion. We don't really know where to go. And a friend, again, could be a spouse. That's even ideal. But when there is a friend in your life, they will help you. They will pick you up in your moments of weakness. And in their moments of weakness, you will be there for them. So B'kitzer, just to summarize this very quickly, Pesach Matzah Maror, I'll go in reverse order, then I'll explain why I went in reverse order. Pesach Matzah Maror connotes 3 steps in achieving our own personal Yetziat Mitzrayim. Maror, cognitively identifying your slavery. Matzah, doing something about it. Action. Pesach, finding a community that shares those values and those goals towards spiritual fellowship and the like. And that is how you take Rabbi Gamliel and you apply it to the personal Yetziat Mitzrayim that all of us go through. So the final remaining question is the order. Because if Maror represents identifying the problem, and Matzah represents doing something about the problem, then logically, let's think about the Seder itself. I should eat Maror and then eat Matzah, because how can I do something about a problem until I know what the problem is? So why do I first eat the Matzah and then eat the Maror? I should eat the Maror and then eat the Matzah. So here's the answer to that. The answer to that would be, I think, that although it's true that I cannot successfully deal with a problem until I identify what the problem is. And this is very important because sometimes we think frenetic action will get me somewhere, but I might be running in the wrong direction. I got to do something about it. Yeah. What I'm doing is I'm running towards the problem instead of away from it. But so it's true, you need a clear sense of maror before you can do matzah. But psychologically, you have to internalize your capacity for constructive change before you confront the negativities. Because when a person confronts their inner Mitzrayim, they confront their slaveries, they're likely to be overwhelmed. They're likely to be depressed. They're likely to be in despair. And then they get paralyzed. So before you start looking into the negativities, you remember the matzah, the capacity for change. And that capacity for change can give me the courage to look into my bitterness. Right? So it's true that you don't do matzah, so to speak, until after Maror. But you have to internalize the message of the matzah first, because that will prevent yeush and despair. And that is why the order is in Rabbi Gamliel and in the Seder, Matzah, Maror, and then even Pesach. Pesach is mentioned first because you need the support systems too in advance. Before you engage in the deep cheshbon hanefesh, you need that sense of community that gives you the strength to proceed. So again, although this sounds like a Pesach shir and the like, but in these parshiot of Yetziat Mitzrayim, we are all experiencing the light of the Exodus, and therefore it's kind of a mini Pesach, meaning to say Hashem puts these forces into the air, enabling us to achieve Yetziat Mitzrayim. And of course the month of Shvat is very symbolic as well. You know, we'll have a Tu B'Shvat Seder, as was announced. But Shvat is technically, in the halachic calendar, the beginning of spring. The beginning of spring. The beginning of growth. Pesach itself has to be in the spring. And therefore, if spring is the symbol of redemption, freedom, renewal, even though it still seems like it's winter out there, the beginnings of that renewal is coming in. And therefore we can indeed think about Yetziat Mitzrayim. So have a good Shabbos, and again, thank you for coming. Neshamot